This is a review of the Sakura Zero radio control touring car. To give you some perspective, this is the first time that we have built a professional level touring car kit. Our previous experience is primarily with the TA-05, the Tamiya TA-05. The instruction manual has got some nice, very big pictures of each of the assembly steps. One thing I did not like about the instruction manual is that there is not very much in the way of instructions. All the parts are described, but there's no advice about shimming, fine-tuning, or adjusting. Now let's take a look at some of the features and issues with building this kit. The ball differential comes with dust cover tape to seal out debris and dirt, and it looks like it will work very well. This is the center gear adapter. 3 Racing claims that you can quickly change the spur gear because there are only 2 screws holding this assembly together. However, without any fasteners holding this assembly together, you're not going to save any time if it falls apart. When building the solid axle, the instructions don't clearly specify the order of assembly. You need to put these pins through the outer joint before you put on the bearing and the outer tube. The steering system allows you to add or remove spacers to adjust the Ackerman effect. Additionally, you can add or remove spacers to change the height of the servo ball joint. This is a bearing holder. It can be rotated to adjust the tension on the belt. There's a dimple that gives you a reference point so that you can count the notches. It's very difficult to see. A drop of white paint in that dimple will make it much easier to see. The instruction manual step 12 is to attach the steering system to the chassis. Later in step 16, the steering links are attached. However, this is difficult because there's not much room to move around between these ball joints and the chassis. It will be easier to attach the steering links before attaching the steering system to the chassis. The suspension arm pins receive these 1mm spacers and these pivot balls. The pivot balls go into the suspension mounts. You can move the spacers from one end of the pin to the other to change the wheelbase of the car with a range of 4mm overall. Not all of the spacers are the same thicknesses. You need to measure all the spacers to make sure that you don't end up with 2 thick spacers or 2 thin spacers on the same suspension arm, otherwise it'll stick or have too much free play. For example, this 1mm spacer is 1.01mm thick. This 1mm spacer is 1.03mm thick. That doesn't seem like much of a difference, but these tiny differences will add up. Consider also that the widths of the suspension arms might differ by 1/100 of a millimeter, and the pivot balls might also differ by 1/100 of a millimeter. So you want to make sure that you don't have all the thickest pieces adding up on one suspension arm, one corner of your car. The pivot balls are also inconsistent lengths. Here I've got a pivot ball that is 4.76 millimeters long, and I'll reset my caliper at that length. This pivot ball is 0.07 millimeters longer. The rear upright has this ball stud on top of it that's mounted on this 12mm set screw. The instructions specify that 5mm of the set screw should be exposed from the hole in the top of the upright. However, the hole in the upright is only 5mm deep. That means 7mm of the screw should be exposed. If you drive this set screw too far into this hole, it's going to interfere with the axle bearing here. The wheel axles are a little bit too long in the threaded portion. This causes them to protrude out beyond the wheel nut. Even with a very fat wheel nut like this one, thicker than the ones that come with the kit, it still protrudes. And I think you can see that if I use this straight edge, like so. You can see that it protrudes out beyond the edge of the rim here, about 1 millimeter. These are HPI zero offset wheels. Possible solutions to this are to add some spacers underneath of the wheel nut, or possibly behind the wheel. That will increase your track width. Or you could file off the end of the axle and just shorten it. I think that's what I will do. In the instructions, some of the pictures of the turnbuckles are not the correct length. Here in step 16, there's a picture of a turnbuckle that is labeled 40 millimeters length, but as you can see from my caliper, it's not 40 millimeters. It's actually 35 millimeter, which matches the length of a different turnbuckle included in the kit. So double check the lengths of all your turnbuckles before assembling. Some of the ball joints are a bit stiff, like this stabilizer link. We can solve that by rounding off the outside edge here of the ball, and I'll show you how to do that. Okay, we're just going to put this ball right in our drill and then use a file to take the edge off while it's turning. Just about like that. That's pretty good. After you have the front lower suspension arms installed, I recommend that you skip ahead in the instructions to install the anti-sway bar. The reason is that you're going to want to make an adjustment to this. As you can see, the angle of these links is quite steep, and the anti-sway bar is pinched in so severely that it's actually holding up the suspension arms, which will fight the damper springs. So we're going to bend these anti-sway bar ends out further and see if we can get that to operate more smoothly. Okay, so we're just using a pair of pliers to spread these stabilizer bars out. Let's see how that fits. I traced the shape of the stabilizer before spreading it out, so there you can see the difference. We have spread the front stabilizer, and that looks like that's going to work better to me. These links here are nearly straight up and down. We still have plenty of clearance for our axle in front of the link. I think we're going to be good. We applied the same spreading on the rear stabilizer, and there's the difference in angle on the rear stabilizer. Not as much as the front stabilizer. With the shocks in the outer hole, the bottom of the shock comes pretty close to the tire. These are HPI super radial tires. The instructions don't mention this, but it's a good idea to round over the leading edge of the bottom of the chassis where it meets the bumper. The instructions specify that the servo be mounted with these 6mm flathead screws. They go through a countersunk washer, then through the servo mount holes, and into the servo mount. And as you can see, that doesn't go in very far to the servo mount, only about 2 threads. An 8mm screw is more appropriate. You can see that this one goes just about all the way through the servo mount. We'll use 8mm screws. The instruction manual also specifies 6mm screws to come up through the chassis into the servo posts. They don't come up very far. 8mm screws look better. To change your pinion, there are a couple of issues. One is you're going to need to remove the battery in order to get access to this area. Another issue is that the rear motor mount screw is obstructed by the spur. 3 Racing provides with the kit this 80-tooth spur that has these very large holes, large enough to pass a screw. If you want to use something other than the 80-tooth spur, you'll need to buy an aftermarket spur, and that's not going to have those very large holes. 3 Racing has addressed this issue with this, a vertical motor mount. It has the motor mount screws at the top and the bottom. This is part number SAK-66. Here we have the vertical motor mount option part installed. As you can see, with this motor mount, the motor mount screws are easily accessible above and below the pinion with no interference problem from our aftermarket spur. The vertical motor mount requires that the front belt be installed on the right side rather than on the left side as specified in the instructions. 3 Racing claims that you can remove the spur gear by simply removing the 2 screws at either end of the lay shaft. Let's check this claim. I'm going to completely loosen the screw at this end of the lay shaft. I'm not going to bother taking it out yet. And then I'm going to attempt to loosen the screw at the other end. But this screw will not come loose. It's turning along with the lay shaft. The easiest way that I've figured out how to remove these screws is by using 2 drivers simultaneously. I'm going to tighten both screws back up. From the tightened state, you can use the 2 drivers to loosen whichever screw feels tighter, and that way you can get the screws loosened to the point where they will come out easily. And there they are. Now that we've got the screws out of the ends of the lay shaft, we need to raise this lay shaft assembly out. In order to do that, we're going to need some slack on one of these 2 belts. To get slack in the rear, we're going to need to remove the entire diff. To get slack in the front, however, we can simply remove the belt off of the front pulley, and that's what I'm going to do here. I'm just going to rotate the transmission forward until that belt comes loose. And now we can get this assembly out. And there's some spacers and shims that you're going to need to hold on to, and there it is out. Overall, the Sakura Zero is a good car. It's a good price considering that it comes with some parts that are optional in other kits, like anti-roll bars. Also, there are many option parts available and they're inexpensive. The quality of the kit was pretty good, although we did have to file off some protruding axles, and it was time consuming getting the free play in the lower suspension arms just right. One peculiarity of this kit is that it comes with these wheels, but no tires. I used wheels and tires that did not come with the kit. The manual was pretty clear overall, but there are a few minor errors, and there are no hints or tips. The lay shaft design was difficult to work on. So that's my experience building the Sakura Zero 1/10 scale radio control touring car.